Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Clara, and today I actually have something very difficult to share with you guys about the Huda Beauty Desert Dusk palette. I'm pretty sure already that I'm gonna get a little bit of hate for saying this, but I just want to be honest with you from the very beginning. I did find that this palette had some really good shades. There are a few really good shades in here that I do love, but it was kind of full of duds. I'm so sorry, you guys. That's just my experience with this palette. I don't know if I got a bad palette. If this palette works for you, that's fantastic. It has some very beautiful colors. So let's continue with that little disclaimer. And I do actually want to compare this palette with some potential dupes, especially the Lila palette, since they did come out around the same time and they do look a little bit similar. And also just off the top of my head, swatching some of these sort of like peachy brown shades, I did find they were a little bit similar to the Too Faced Just Peachy Mattes palette that came out recently. And if you've watched my video, you guys know that I actually ended up really loving most of those matte shades in there. So let's just jump right in and talk about this. And I do have 3 different looks that I filmed with this palette, this being the third. And I was kind of trying to replicate the looks that I did for the Natasha Denona palette using the like similar shades from this palette, just to kind of see what the differences are. Let's talk first about the matte shades in here. Now, most of the matte shades in this palette are kind of your standard, like peachy, red, brown, orangey colors, which have been very popular since the Modern Renaissance palette. I'm sure there are probably some dupes in there. But in particular, the peachy colors in here looked like they had some dupes from the Too Faced Just Peachy Mattes palette. So let's just talk about the dupes that I found from there first. So we have the shade Eden, which looks very similar to the Just Peachy shade from the Too Faced palette. I was hoping that the shade Oud could be duplicated by the Peach Tart shade, but actually the Oud is a lot more of a reddish warm brown. And then lastly, the shade Saffron is almost an exact dupe for the shade Peach Sangria. And I do have to mention that this shade Saffron was one of the absolute worst blending shades from the Desert Dusk palette. Also the shade Amber, I don't know, it just didn't want to stick onto my eyes. It was the weirdest thing ever. When I kept trying to add more, it didn't want to blend out. It like left bald spots. It was extremely frustrating to work with. Yeah, that's my little rant for today. I do want to mention something really good though, and that is the Amethyst shade from this palette is stunning. It is so beautiful. I love that shade. Now let's talk about the Desert Dusk compared to the Lila palette. You can see right away that the size of the pans in the Lila palette are huge compared to the Huda Beauty. They're just bigger than most eyeshadows in general, so no surprise there. But the Lila palette is twice as expensive as the Huda Beauty palette, and the Huda Beauty palette has 25.2 grams of product, and the Lila palette has 37.5, so that's not twice as much product. Twice as much product would be around 50 grams. That being said, I didn't think there was a single dud in the Lila palette, and there were quite a few that were misses for me in the Huda Beauty palette, so I do think you're getting your value out of the Lila palette, and also the shades in the Lila palette are just incredibly like buttery and smooth and creamy. They're amazing. Seriously, you guys. And if you know anything about Natasha Denona, you'll know that her shadows are very, very pigmented. Some of the shades in the Huda Beauty palette are a little more sheer, and there are certain ones that I actually kind of prefer that way. The one thing I did mention in my Lila review that I missed in the Lila palette was a nice matte brow bone shade, and the Huda Beauty palette does have the Desert Sand matte shade, and that does make a very nice kind of transition, cleaning up color. Something about those shadows though is they are pretty powdery, so just be careful when you put your brush in there because they do kick up quite a bit of product. So the shade Musk from the Huda Beauty palette is very similar to the Nude Mauve shade from the Lila palette, except the Nude Mauve shade is a little bit more gray and has a slightly more purple tone to it. Now, even though the shade Oud didn't have a dupe from the Too Faced Just Peachy Mattes palette, Nude Vino from the Lila palette is almost an exact dupe. There are two shades that are very similar, and that's Celestial and Nefertiti. Celestial does have a little bit of like a pink peach shift that Nefertiti doesn't have, and Nefertiti has a little bit more individual particles of sparkle. There is a gold shade in the Lila palette called Magnolia, and that one is very extremely beautiful, definitely buttery, very pigmented. But it is a little bit more of an orange gold. It's definitely slightly deeper. Now I really like the effect that Nefertiti has on the eye. I did use it in the inner corner of my eye for I think all three looks because it is the most brightening shade in this palette. However, that being said, some of these shades are very kind of like gritty in texture. They're not very smooth. And Nefertiti is one of those shades. I noticed immediately when I was swatching it, and when I applied it on my eye, I got a lot of fallout, like it's everywhere. I cannot get it off, and that's so frustrating. And I do want to mention that because I was comparing this to the Lila palette, and I'm used to using a glitter glue with all of my Natasha Denona shadows, plus the fact that a lot of the shades in the Huda Beauty palette looked very glittery, I did combine my Too Faced Shadow Insurance Primer with their glitter glue primer, which is kind of my standard procedure for my glittery shadows. And it still had the fallout even though I was using a glitter glue. Okay, let's talk about the shade Twilight. This is one of my favorite shades in the palette. It's so beautiful. It's kind of like a purpley mauve shade underneath, but then it has a very strong, bright, like blue silver shift to it. It's beautiful. It looks a little bit similar to Backlight from Makeup Geek, and I just compared it to the shade Livid from the Natasha Denona palette. Even though that one is much darker in tone, it's kind of the like equivalent since it's a purple with a blue shift. Definitely though, you don't get that kind of icy shine on the lids, which I was sort of hoping for with that shade. That being said, it's very pigmented, it's very buttery, it's smooth, it's wonderful. I was just hoping the shade Livid would pop a little more like this shade Twilight from the Huda palette. That is one shade that I actually prefer in the Huda palette. Now let's talk about the other one that was slightly similar in tone, and that is Amethyst. That one is very similar in tone to Viola, even though Viola is a shimmer. And Viola is just slightly more magenta, while the Amethyst is more of a kind of blue-purple. Can we talk about the shade Royal for a second? It's a beautiful, beautiful purple shimmer color. This is another one of my favorites from the Huda palette. I love this color so much, and it's very creamy, very easy to work with. I have no complaints. Now let's talk about the shade Retrograde. Retrograde is another duochrome like this Twilight shade down here. But both Twilight and Angelic, which are duochromes, they have a smoother texture. Retrograde is another very gritty shadow. So you can see how it really shifts quite strongly from that like dark red color to the green. So with Retrograde and Twilight, you can build them up to be a little bit stronger, but they're supposed to go on sheer at first so you can kind of like transform the color of the eyeshadow underneath that. And I think it's a brilliant idea that lets you kind of change the color of so many eyeshadows. And they're really stunning, like the way that they hit the light, they're very brightening, and even though Retrograde is kind of a gritty shadow, I love the color. It doesn't swatch very well because it is kind of sheer, but it does have a lovely like bright green kind of shine to it. I love that. By description, the shade Dragon Bite from the Natasha Denona palette is a similar kind of like red-brown base with a green shine over the top. However, the Natasha Denona shadow is definitely much more pigmented. You get mostly that kind of red-brown coming through and a little bit less of that green sparkle. It's very subtle in the Natasha Denona one. So when I compared the two looks that I did using the kind of green red shadows from both palettes, I actually preferred the pop of brightness that Retrograde gave me. It's another one of my favorite shades from the palette, and I didn't get a lot of fallout just like pressing it on the lids, even though it's kind of gritty. Another shade that's very similar is Kashmir from the Huda Beauty palette, which is quite similar to Helio from the Lila palette. They're both a silvery taupe, but the Natasha Denona one has just a little bit more of that redness to it. Okay, another favorite shade that I have from the Huda palette is the shade Angelic, And actually when I first played with the rose gold palette in store, that was the one shade that I was like, yes, I need you, come home with me. It's a very strong kind of baby pink duochrome with a gold shine over it, but I'm glad that it's actually also in the Desert Dusk palette. Do we have to talk about the shade Cosmo? It's a glitter shade, but it's like pure glitter. Okay, another shade that I really liked was Turkish Delight. I swatched Turkish Delight next to the shade Purpure from the Lila palette. Purpure is a little bit more purple, even though the kind of reflect is that similar kind of like reddish orange color. Blazing is a really beautiful burnt orange kind of shade. In terms of tone, Blazing is very similar to Cyclone, even though Cyclone is a shimmer and Blazing is a matte. Cyclone catches the light as kind of a pink duochrome, so there's the difference. I hope that you have found this really helpful. My goal is not to bash your favorite palette if this is your new favorite palette, but to give you an honest review for people who don't want to go out and spend 70 bucks on something where not every shadow is excellent. I personally prefer the Lila palette in general, but there are certain shades from the Huda palette that I did really, really love. So in other news, I have been really in love with Pat McGrath lately, and if you haven't seen her Instagram, I suggest you check her out. She's amazing. I picked up some lipsticks from her and I will review those as soon as they're here, and I'm contemplating getting her eyeshadow palettes. Let me know your guys' thoughts on Pat McGrath and if you're gonna pick anything up. And stay tuned for those videos. I'll talk to you again really soon, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy videos like this. Bye guys!